And now I'd like to open the floor to the audience in the room and online for questions or comments and further discussion. Any questions or comments? Yes, I'll take two or three, and if you could identify yourself and any organizational affiliation, and if you're directing it towards a specific panelist or not. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Chidi Wanus. I'm a blogger. I write about the Lake Chad crisis, and I'm also reservist with the Defense Cultural Specialist Unit. So I look upon this with my two heads, the military head and maybe the Nigerian security head. And first, before I launch into any comments to a question, I want to just first thank all the international agencies who've come to help in the Northeast, because you've done an excellent job, and it's acknowledged on the on the ground as well. So in the event that I come across as excessively harsh, that gratitude is there and it permeates with all Nigerians. The first thing is that I think, and maybe this comes as a comment more than a question, but the thing is that I think the biggest thing, and it's been mentioned, but it's kind of been mentioned as an aside, is that the protection element is the key. In that, a lot of these things, there's a lot of discussion about, the international agencies need to plan for this and for that, but the key element is that this is a war, and the key driver of this conflict is not, all the other things were, there was always a famine in Niger, and there's always been a famine in Diffa, and there's always been a famine in Chad. The Borno state has been what has maybe prevented them from falling into crisis from the agricultural output. The war has changed that. So until that war ends, until the Nigerian military defeats Boko Haram, it doesn't matter what international agencies do. The war needs to end. And it's slightly curious to me that in a discussion like this, there is no representation from the governments in the regions, because they are the ones who will end this war, and they are the ones who will then create the space for local and international agencies to solve the problem. And the second thing, just to maybe take, I think most of what Mr. Lanza said was spot on, but I kind of take askance with one of his comments in that people won't go home. People desperately want to go home. From everybody, all the IDPs I've met, the people who I know who are in that area, everybody wants to go home, whether they're able to or not. Quite a few that I know have tried to go home to, work their farms, go and log and all that stuff, and got killed. But people are still going back. Once that, again, it goes back to once that security space is there, people will inevitably go back. And sorry, another point I wanted to take to task was again about funding in terms of how the local areas is funded. Nigeria has a fairly well worked out formula for how each state gets money from the central government. And Borno State gets its based on head of population and the number of local government areas. So the point is not that there's no funding from the federal government, it's how that funding is dispersed by the state government and the local governments. And I think that's been one of the keys. Borno State is huge. So it will take a fairly competent and innovative leader to be able to disperse funds accurately. And I don't think that those adjectives, could be used for any Nigerian politician, to be honest. So it's something that I think is looking to say that the federal government should put more funds into it. Yes, there should be emergency funding, but all you'll be doing is increasing the pot for people to steal from. So it's about how that funding is brought in and, the oversight that is put on top of it. And I think, because I'm rabbiting on, I'm just going to touch on one final point, which is gender. Again, it was mentioned by Ms. Reid about, slightly mentioned, but as an aside, a lot of the focus is on the violence against females. Which is key and which is terrible. But I think that the key demographic here is boys and young men. This war is a war of boys and young men. They are the drivers. It's the disenfranchisement and desperation of young men and boys that has driven this conflict. And a lot of the focus is on females and how the crisis has affected females, when the key victims have actually been young boys. Young boys have been burnt alive in their schools, have been kidnapped. I mean, more boys were kidnapped from Damasak than have been kidnapped from Chibok or anywhere else. Whole villages in Cameroon have been depopulated of young boys. And until we focus on, what are the key, as an African male, the key problem for young, especially young, and I'm going to use the word peasants, I'm sorry if this sounds offensive, but young rural African males is getting married. It's very expensive. So the kidnappings and all of that stuff is a continuation of a problem that maybe needs to be addressed again internally by the Nigerian government and Nigerian society. But the focus on the violence against females and the effects against females kind of obscures what is the key driver of this crisis, which is not just poor governance, but how poor governance disenfranchises and affects males in a patriarchal male-dominated society where a man without status is nothing.
Thank you very much. Other questions, comments? Really? Let me see if we have anything from our online audience. Nothing's come through. We're having a technical difficulty. Oh, right. Thank you. This is a question from John Borton, who many of you may know. For the last 2 to 3 years, Nigerian nationals have consistently formed the largest national group of irregular migrants arriving by sea in Italy. What proportion of this irregular migrant flow does the panel think is made up of those displaced by the protection crisis in northeast Nigeria? So that's an interesting question, not an easy one, I would imagine, to answer. Any other comments or questions from the audience? Martin. The microphone's just coming. There you go.
Well, thanks. I'm reluctant really to ask a question about an area that I know so little about, but I'm particularly interested at the moment in the role and in the role of local organisations. So I was interested, John, when you referred to the local organisations, I think in Niger. In the global sense, we're talking about the new way of working. Is that having an impact in the kind of way that you're working with local organisations in Niger or in the other countries?
Thank you. Let's start with those, and I'm going to go to Toby first. Toby, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
Okay, 3 points, if I may. The gentleman who took the floor is confusing two things, if I may. One is people's desire to go home. That is one issue. And I would certainly agree with him that when one asks displaced people, would you like to go home? The vast majority will always say yes. It's about memories, it's about nostalgia, it's attachment to land, it's where ancestors are buried. There is certainly a desire to go home. That's one thing, but one shouldn't confuse that with the likelihood that one will go home. That's a very different matter. We know from research that for every year of displacement, the likelihood of return decreases by about 9.5%. So that means that after a decade of displacement, what you're really looking at is about 39% of those who have been displaced who are still likely to go home. And there are lots and lots of reasons for that. People will have had children, they will have set up shop elsewhere, they're not just sitting in a camp and waiting for a handout. They're getting on with life. And then to put that down and say, aha, that life we had 10 years ago is maybe still there, let's go and rebuild it. That's actually a very big ask. So that's, excuse me, that's my first comment. Second comment, the question about migrants. The answer to that is very few, but more and more. What do I mean by that? IOM and others have been tracking this. We know that most of the Nigerians arriving on the shores of Italy or elsewhere in Europe are from the north of Nigeria, but it's west of Borno. It tends to be from states such as Kano. Sadly, it tends to be a lot of women who are being trafficked. But so it's not directly related to the violence which has been taking place in the northeast. However, I would be willing to say that there'll be an increasing proportion of people who say, I've had enough of this, information travels fast, I'll try my luck in another way. On the third issue of local, actually I meant to mention this earlier, so I'd like to thank your participant in London for raising it. Really, I mean, this is part of the solution. It's also part of a slightly more humble approach and a deferential recognition that, we keep saying this, the first responders are the local communities, they are the neighbours, etc. There is no greater generosity anywhere on earth than a family in Diffa that welcomes a refugee from Borno State. We're talking about the poorest of the poor who open up their hearts and their homes to people. And the solutions have to include helping local people and local institutions play a greater role in all of this. So I'd like to thank, I missed his name, forgive me, but I'd like to thank him for having raised that point.
It's Martin Barber. Martin Barber, yeah.
Martin, sorry, I should have recognized your voice. Great that you're there.
Thanks, Toby. Chitra, are you still on the line?
Yes, I am.
Oh, thank you. Do you have any responses to make to any of those comments or questions?
Yes, I wanted to respond to the point made around how the conflict is impacting men and boys, as well as women and girls, and the ways in which dominant norms of masculinity are driving the conflict in northeast Nigeria. I think we need to look at the ways in which the pattern of civilian harm in northeast Nigeria is very gendered. So we know that men make up the majority of those who are killed, who are detained by the Nigerian security forces, who are associated with armed opposition groups. And we know that there is a spectrum of association between voluntary to forced, whereas women are those who are left behind, who make up the majority of people who are displaced, primarily because the men are no more around. So in many places, one of the first things that the armed opposition groups did when they arrived into an area was to kill all the men of fighting age. And by this, I mean including boys as young as 9, 10, or 11, up to those who are middle-aged. So in many places, you actually only have left there women, girls, young boys, and older people. And I think partly as humanitarians, that could be one of the reasons why we're really looking at how we deliver for women and girls in a particular situation, because the men and boys who are at risk are not around by the time we get there. And of course, women and girls face other risks, particularly gender-based violence, as has been mentioned before. I think the person in the audience made a very interesting point on the ways in which masculinity drives conflict in northeast Nigeria also. And in a previous role, I did some research looking at the intersections between masculinity, conflict, and violence, including in Borno. And there we saw, yes, the importance of marriage as a marker of transition to adulthood, and the fact that men were not able to get married, adding to their sense of frustration, particularly in the context of the inequality that they're seeing around them. We saw the importance of being married, being employed, and having money in terms of getting societal respect in your community, particularly given that we're living in what is an increasingly consumerist and capitalist society. So I agree that we need to look at the way that masculinity drives conflict and violence in northeast Nigeria. But I would also say that we need to look at the ways in which gender roles for women and girls also drives the conflict. So, for example, we knew in the early days that lots of women joined what was then called the Utopia movement because of the increased status that they received within the group and the increased access to knowledge, particularly religious knowledge, which had been closed to them due to dominant social-cultural norms in the rest of society. Also the role of economic marginalization. So I spoke to women who had smuggled guns across checkpoints, and this is a time where women were not considered suspicious. And in a context where lots of avenues to earning income and livelihoods is close to you, because of the patriarchal society in which you live, your husband or father has been killed or detained or is just missing, and yet you have this group that is offering you, say, 1,500 naira for every gun that you smuggle across a checkpoint. You can see how women's marginalization and unequal gendered power dynamics also feeds into and perpetuates the conflict.
Thank you very much, Chitra. Oh, sorry. Did you have more?
No, that's it.
Okay.
For now, at least.
Great. I'm going to turn to John now.
Great, thanks. I'd like to pick up on Martin's great comments and also briefly on First Gentleman's comment. Toby put it very eloquently. It's the local communities who, out of their generosity, are providing that frontline humanitarian response. It's 300,000 people displaced in Difa, and it's just incredible the response that local communities have given. In terms of the question about new ways of working, and I think you're touching a little bit on the localization theme here, IRC is increasingly working with local organizations. The organization that we're working with in Difa is the Niger Association for Human Rights. And they're best placed to understand the context. They have those established relationships and also access as well. So there's a whole range of reasons why it makes sense to work with local organisations. And of course, there are some risks for those local organisations that we need to consider too. I wanted to just build a little bit on that first comment that you made around it's only until the Nigerian military defeat Boko Haram that the situation will change. There may be an element of truth to that. I think if we're looking about defeating Boko Haram, we also need to look at some of the underlying causes, which makes it attractive for young boys and men to join Boko Haram. And so in terms of the humanitarian imperative for an organisation like IRC to respond, that remains. But we also need to really focus on some of the developmental efforts that tie into that to ensure that there is access to education, there are economic opportunities and the like.
Thanks, John. I'd say, too, that when you have a chance to look at the magazine, there are a couple of interesting articles which talk about the federal and state dynamics there, and also one which outlines the evolution of Boko Haram by someone who's written a book about that. So it would be interesting to get your feedback on what you think about those. Joe, I'm going to turn to you now.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, to build on the answers that have already been given, I think with regard to the movement of people from Nigeria coming to Europe, I think as we see, and it's not specific to Nigeria, we could easily be speaking about people from Eritrea, people from Sudan and else. You have to have a phenomenal amount of resources in order to afford to come to Europe. As we see in every context in the world, people who are able to become refugees instead of IDPs do so on the basis of resources. If we look at displacement patterns within northeast Nigeria during the lifetime of the Boko Haram crisis, the people who left earlier were communities that had resources, predominantly those from market towns, those who had networks elsewhere in Nigeria, those who were employed by the central government or from local administrations. People with resources are able to move. And whilst we look at displacement as a vulnerable group, we also see that displacement is in itself a coping strategy, and for many people there's a great number of risks that come from not moving. And so the way I would tie this in, just to speak about who is coming to Europe from Nigeria, and without getting too far into the details of different parts of the country, I would just say it's people with resources. Is it people who have been forcibly displaced from agricultural land in Yobe State or in Borno? No, because we have to look at who are the people who have access to those resources, people who are traders, who have access to other networks that can help them make these journeys to be able to get to Libya and to elsewhere. because when we look at the route that people are taking from West Africa, we see it as difficult. I mean, even people who are moving towards Europe from the area of North Nigeria, it is not a direct route going from there. And I think, as Toby's pointed out, IOM has been doing a great amount of research tracking the movement of people, and we're seeing in a number of countries, even though we do have sources such as the EU Trust Fund that have provided funds to groups to respond to refugees and to respond to IDPs, so that people don't have to reach Europe to reach assistance. We're not actually seeing the research yet that shows people affected by conflict are more likely to try to come to Europe. What we have seen throughout all the research is that people with resources to move. In terms of localization, just to mention, an EU project will be beginning in Nigeria, implemented by a number of NGOs, and this is a 4-country project, specifically looking at localization, specifically providing resources to national and local NGOs, many of whom were represented at the Lake Chad Basin conference in Oslo in February, but I think it is agreed across the spectrum of international organizations, both UN and NGO, and particularly has been taken on board by ECHO, that there is a need to do more in that respect. Unfortunately, that project just specific to Nigeria, but hopefully that can have some positive effects elsewhere. So I would be happy to talk to you at length, I think, about the gender dimensions of the crisis, and would be really interested to hear more of your thoughts. But I would just point out that in this issue, which is looking at humanitarian practice in the Lake Chad Basin, we've tried to look at a number of the issues that we are dealing with in the course of humanitarian practice, and one of them, and it is very much from my background as somebody that works on sexual and gender-based violence, one of the issues we've experienced in humanitarian practice is an inability to adequately respond to the scale of sexual violence, sexual exploitation and abuse of women and girls. And that's why I wanted to spend time in my article really exploring that more. That is not to say that there aren't barriers or that there would be insufficient assistance for men and boys.
Thanks, Joe. Now, we could take one more round of questions and then quick answers from our panelists as we're running out of time. I've got someone here in the audience, and I've got 2 online questions. Please.
Hello, Brendan Bromwich with King's College London. And I'm working on Darfur and looking at some of the similarities here, particularly with respect to this whole question of the very long-term trajectory. And Toby mentioned the population growth and so on. And in Darfur, what we found is a very strong linkage that we weren't picking up at the time of the humanitarian program, 2004, 5, 6, 7. For example, with the sexual-based violence, was part of a wider contest over the identity of Darfur, destroying different solidarity groups in the communities of the victims. Now, what I'm hearing, this is how it's resonating with what we're hearing about the challenges facing the young men and so on in Lake Chad. And so my question is really in terms of what research and what is the trajectory being done about the research, what are the processes of dialogue in terms of what is the region going to look like 10 years from now, 20 years from now? Because if you've got this big young population, and on the one hand you've got Boko Haram, and for what I understand this is it has some kind of vision about Western kind of education being haram and so on, and I don't know the details. And that's one trajectory they've got. Another trajectory they've got is to flee to Europe. You know, I something quite the opposite. So my question really is in terms of, you know, linking all of these big ticket items about what is the region going to look like 20 years from now, because I think in that question there are it just ties some of these issues together. And particularly in terms of return, okay, well, return to what? So just a question, just to see if we can look at the much bigger picture and unpack some of those issues.
Thank you very much. I'm going to read out 2 questions here, and then I'm going to ask our panelists to give very speedy, condensed responses, since unfortunately we're running out of time. There's never enough time for the rich discussion we want to have. The first is from Clea Khan, who is a consultant, and I know she has worked with both DFID and MSF in the past, amongst others, and the Red Cross. Clea says, thank you for a really interesting discussion. There was a reference to the Nigerian government's lack of experience with conflict. I've also heard concern about lack of experienced international and national staff, including both UN and NGOs. The quality of assistance, and particularly protection, is not going to get better unless international organizations invest in capacity building. How do we prevent deprioritization of the region, I think, in this regard? The second question is from Jane Backhurst, who's been working with Christian Aid. Jane. I know. I think Jane is working with Christian Aid or possibly the Red Cross, but she said Christian Aid, Oxfam, Tear Fund, Action Aid, CARE, and CAFOD have just started a project funded by ECHO. Is this the one?
Yes.
Okay, so this is the one that Joe, I think, just talked about, Jane. And she says, looking forward to working with other NGOs as this project supports local and national NGO leadership of humanitarian response and in decision-making structures. So we've just got really the question from, I'm sorry, is it Brendan? Yeah, Brendan, and from Clea. And let's go again to Toby first.
Thank you, Wendy. Brendan, hi. Great to hear your voice, and now I know where to find you.
Thank you. I look forward to it.
I think that's a wonderful question that you posed, and that's really a question for the people of the region and for the authorities of the region. Where do you want to be in 20 years' time? How do you want to get there? And I think in so many places where international attention is fleeting, it comes and goes. This particular crisis may be, a top 10 crisis on people's minds at the moment. It may be overlooked next year. It may be forgotten in 3 years, and then it will bounce back. The real issue will be, how do local communities and how do the local authorities have a conversation, have a social contract about where they want to be and how they're going to get there in 20 years' time. And there will be security elements to that, there will be trade elements to that, there will be environmental protection elements to that, a citizen's charter, if you will, to ensure that every girl can access quality education and stay there beyond the age of 12, 13 and 14. I mean, one of the things that I often discussed with the governor of Borno, who is a very charismatic and able person, and he's I would say probably more of a technocrat than a politician. I would really ask him, where do you want to be and how are you going to get there? And how can the international community, with its very limited resources, given all of the other crises, how can we help? Because essentially you will be the driver of change here. And, excuse me, I think that's absolutely the right question. And again, we who work in the humanitarian field could be more demanding of that question and could be thinking more about it. It's easy to get focused on some of the very pressing nutritional or protection issues that some of my colleagues on the panel have spoken about. I would like to suggest that we also have a bit of a long-term vision and concern, even if it's not us who will bring about that change, but that we call for it and demand real action on the ground so that we're not still talking about this one in 20 years' time. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. Chitra, are you still with us?
I am, yes.
Thank you.
I wanted to slightly correct what I had said about the Nigerian military's lack of experience of conflict. I wasn't saying that the Nigerian military lack experience of conflict in general. Obviously, Nigeria has been and continues to be a troop contributing country to UN peacekeeping missions. But rather, I think fighting this type of conflict in Nigeria is something that's new to the Nigerian armed forces. And I also had a response to the question as to how the region will look like 10, 20 years from now. And let me concentrate my response on Northeast Nigeria, if I may. As someone who has been engaged in Northeast Nigeria in one way or the other for about 4.5, 5 years now, I can tell you that there's very little conflict analysis that has been done and that has been publicly available, particularly at the local level. And for me, this is one of the biggest gaps that I see in the humanitarian response, the lack of proper localized context and conflict analysis that includes trajectories of how conflict dynamics may morph and change. And I think this is one of the, I think this is impeding our ability to be as effective as we can be, as well as impeding our ability to be conflict sensitive. And I'm seeing conflict dynamics exacerbated or created due to the actions of humanitarian actors. I do think that there needs to be real thinking about the way in which the conflict may change in the next 5, 10, 20 years, either in terms of how the armed opposition groups themselves may change their tactics and strategies. And I think one thing that we have seen from the past few years is that they can and do change tactics and strategies. So when I first started working in Northeast Nigeria in 2013, no one would ever have thought that there would be people carrying IEDs, the so-called suicide bombers. Abductions were something that were new. The attempt to capture and hold on to territory, that was something that was unheard of. And so we know that this is a group that does mutate to suit the changing situation. We also know that there are new groups that may become or change their role in the conflict. For example, the vigilante groups and the civilian joint task force. So these are people in communities who are gathered to fight armed opposition groups, but there are already some indications of human rights abuses committed by them. There's also the possibility of reprisals and counter-reprisals, and already we're seeing some reports of this. And unfortunately, some of them taking religious or ethno-linguistic terms. So in some areas, we've seen that tensions that may have been existing already before between different ethno-linguistic groups or religious groups have been heightened due to the conflict related to the armed opposition groups, including due to perceptions of bias when it comes to humanitarian assistance. Also, we have other forms of conflict dynamics that were there before that have been affected by what we've seen happening in Northeast Nigeria, such as the conflict between farmers, pastoralists, hunters, fisherfolk, etc. And of course, we have elections coming up in 2019, and mobilization around the elections has already started. Of course, we have to consider the political economy of conflict and the opportunities for personal revenue generation that exists due to the crisis, and how all of this will feed into each other in the next 2, 5, 10, 15 years. And my final point is the need to recognize continuities and discontinuities. And the speaker spoke about Boko Haram, meaning, so-called Western educationist haram. I think that this is actually a simplification of the message of the armed opposition group, but we need to accept and realize that there was an antipathy towards so-called Western education long before the conflict. And so this is not something that is new. And actually, this is something that has been changing as a result of the experiences that people of Northeast Nigeria have lived through. And so there is an increasing recognition of the importance of education precisely because of their experiences.
Thank you so much, Chitra. I'm afraid we're just about out of time, so I'm going to ask John and then Joe to make some very brief final comments in response to the questions.
On sentence answers. Okay, building on Chitra's response, the conflict dynamics 20 years out, we need to situate that in looking at the population growth, climate change, resource degradation, economic opportunities. And I wanted to pick up very briefly on Clear's last point. How do we prevent the deprioritisation of the Lake Chad crisis? I asked a similar question to David Miliband, IRC CEO, last week. His response I thought was great. He said that crises become forgotten because they're seen as intractable or hopeless, and then we need to do a much better job of articulating clear solutions and also demonstrating the impact that we're having.
Thank you, John. Joe, the last word is for you.
I will be as speedy as possible, and so we'll just add on one point to my colleagues' responses to each of the questions. I've worked in Sudan and Nigeria for the past decade, and what strikes me as a key difference, and that's going to play out in a different way in the Lake Chad region in comparison to the work that we're currently doing in Darfur, trying to work on durable solutions with communities there, is that the camp setup, which has in effect established cities. I think by 2009 we had 50% of the Darfuri population was living in urban or peri-urban areas. I think I actually remember a memo from Toby circulated at this time with that statistic. And whereas in Nigeria we're seeing Maiduguri become a mega city, we have seen an increase in the size of other cities like Adamawa or Mubi or Damaturu that have swelled with displaced populations. But whereas in Darfur, we have had the emergence of these cities in areas where there have been large numbers of IDPs, and the challenge now is what is the solutions package that can be offered that helps people and incentivizes people who wish to move back to areas of origin when they have lived in a city for that amount of time. The challenge that I'm seeing, at least in my work in northeast Nigeria, is how do we get people who've lived in provincial towns to walk away from the opportunities that they have seen, and some have been mentioned, in livelihoods and education, and a difference in the cultural life of a city the size of Maiduguri. And as Toby's pointed to, there huge infrastructure challenges come with that. And we've seen that every time we've had a cholera outbreak. A lot would need to be done to actually equip the city to deal in the long term with twice its previous population. And the challenge that we're still having now, development actors working with the Nigerian government to look at how can basic services as well as civilian administration be restored in the local government area capitals. And then in response to Clear's comment, I'd just like to add that in addition to capacity building, which is vital amongst government actors, amongst UN, INGO, national NGO actors, international standards are absolutely crucial for any capacity building to be useful. Training alone does not have the impact unless you are working in a system that meets standards, whether those standards be sphere, whether they be humanitarian principles, whether they be standards related to protection and do no harm. And I think that we have to look not only at the investment and the learning in training and in capacity building and in bringing in technical expertise where it is needed for those processes, but we have to meet standards in the response in Nigeria, in Cameroon, in Chad and Niger in order to operationalize that training. Otherwise, we're undercutting the work that we're trying to do. So.
Thank you very much, Joe. I'm sorry, we have run out of time. We've run over a little bit, which is down to my poor timekeeping and chairing, I suspect. But I'd like to thank all of you for coming today and the online audience for joining us, for all of your excellent questions and comments. And I'd especially like to thank our panelists. Toby, thank you so much for joining us from Afghanistan. I know you have many more pressing things to do, and we really appreciate you making the time. And Chitra also, thank you so much for joining us on the telephone line. We were able to hear you very well, and we really appreciate you making the effort to do that. Thank you. And to Joe, my co-editor, and also to John for their very interesting and insightful input. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you.